pleasure to join you all here today for the Future City Summit. I think it's both incredibly fitting, but also important that this summit is being hosted by Hong Kong. Coastal cities like Hong Kong are on the front lines of the fight against climate change. And the way in which cities respond to these challenges in the days, the weeks, and the months to come will shape our global future. And I mean that quite literally, that cities are home to a growing majority of the world's population. They're drivers of the global economy, generating more than 80% of global GDP. The future is urban. Our ability as cities to really craft a future that delivers for all is our ability to craft a world that works for all. When we talk about challenges like climate change, it can be tempting to talk about statistics like temperature increases, sea level rise, or perhaps increases in rainfall and other weather changes. But these, I believe, can actually blur the human reality of climate change and the fact that impacts of natural and man-made disasters are felt very differently depending on the level of resources and the support networks that are available to individual resources. And these inequities have been front and center over the last couple years as the COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged communities around the globe. If you run a local shop in Sri Lanka and Sierra Leone, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't just an inconvenience, it devastated lives and local economies. In Peru, for example, 81% of households reported losses in the first months of the pandemic, economic losses. In Senegal, that number was 85% of households reporting economic loss. And globally, the number of people living in extreme poverty, that's less than $1.90 a day, has increased by more than 97 million people because of this pandemic. It can be a bit hard to get our heads around this, particularly because for a number of us who are in this meeting and work in the knowledge economy, COVID-19 may have simply meant working from home, curbing some of our social activities. And I think whereas it can be sometimes disturbing and uncomfortable to admit this, the pandemic actually decreased costs and improved efficiency and created better work-life balance for a subset of the world's population. That, there's parts of the world today who are actually much wealthier in contrast to, the millions of people that have been brought into poverty and the millions of lives lost and families devastated. And this is the world in which we live today. It is a world that is defined by global crises, but realities that are very different at the local and the individual level. And it would be nice to say that the last couple of years are simply an anomaly, that we will recover from this pandemic, we turn the page and life resumes. But in fact, the new norm is one of constant change, unpredictability, and very likely great instability. And so our challenge, all of our challenge, everyone here as part of this summit, is to see how do we build cities that can evolve, that can adapt. And this is not about some naive hope of preventing change, but rather to embrace and to shape this change ahead. Last week, I organized what was the World Economic Forum's Inaugural Urban Transformation Summit. It's a new global event aimed at helping to advance more sustainable and equitable cities. And we held this event in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. which is serving as the headquarters for our new Global Center for Urban Transformation. And now, just as a little bit of background on that particular place, that particular city, many people might know Detroit as the home of the American auto industry. It's the place that General Motors and Ford are based. It's also, historically the home of Motown music and a lot of great sort of Black entertainment and culture. However, there's also a sort of darker history to cities like Detroit. And it's a history of real systemic racism and inequality. That Detroit is the largest Black majority city in the United States, and roughly 30% of residents in Detroit live below the poverty level. And I shared this to say that, perhaps not surprisingly, when the World Economic Forum shows up talking about urban transformation, it can spark great concern and real historic trauma, because in much of the sort of recent history, transformation has been to the benefit of some, but not all residents. And in fact, for many residents, the transformations of cities in the past has actually made life a lot harder and actually catapulted individuals into poverty. And so, when early on with this initiative, when we were building this center out, I was actually approached and folks suggested that perhaps we shouldn't use this word urban transformation. Maybe we're better off just talking about words like sustainability. But I actually strongly believe that we cannot dance around the reality of today and the challenges at hand, that our cities have to be transforming. The question is not if they will change, the question is how they will change. And if we look at some of the cities that we oftentimes put up on a pedestal as sort of our global lighthouses, cities known for sort of prosperity and opportunity, cities like New York, where I spent most of my adulthood, these are cities that have not always been in times of prosperity, where life has not always been good. You look at New York City in the 1980s, was a very sort of dark and dismal place. But what makes cities like New York special, what enables them to thrive and to remain vibrant places, is that they are always evolving. They are always transforming and reinventing themselves. And so, in addition to sort of embracing this change, we also need to acknowledge that government alone cannot drive and shape the future of our cities. Simply put, the challenges are too immense, and public-private collaboration is no longer simply a good to have, something that you strive for. Increasingly, public-private collaboration is and will become more and more essential. Cities that are able to really work closely together, to have the public and private sector aligning their efforts together, are the cities that will thrive, that will continue to grow. So what are we doing, and what can each of you do to help build cities of the future? First, I think it's critically important that we really push our cities and support our cities in having clear shared visions for the future. A moment ago, we heard Stephen Phillips talk about Hong Kong's climate action plan. A lot of times when you might hear these various plans and you might say, okay, that's all good, but at the end of the day, what matters is implementation. Well, I can tell you, having spent most of the last decade working in City Hall that if done right, these strategic plans, they not only provide you with a North Star and a direction, but actually can help you overcome a lot of the traditional challenges that government face when it comes to implementation. In New York, the strategic plan actually dates back to 2007. It was under Mayor Bloomberg, and it was originally called Plan NYC. And the goal there was to align the city's economic development strategy with sustainability goals. What happened is that plan has really sort of evolved over time, and adding to that were issues that are goals related to resiliency, goals related to equity. But what makes that plan so critically important is it is actually embedded into the work of government, that every 4 years, the city is required by law to update that plan. And that timing is strategically sequenced to ensure that every political administration will have to inherit the plan of their predecessor and also have their ability to leave their fingerprint to update that plan. The city's capital plans, its long-term investments in capital, are directly tied to that strategic plan. So when you're planning 10 and 20 years out and looking at these long-term infrastructure investments, they're directly tied into a strategic plan. The city's major initiatives are all directly tied to the goals in the strategic plan. So you can actually draw a direct line between priority initiatives and budget lines and the particular metrics or goals that the city is seeking to achieve in the long term. So when I look at some of the initiatives that I was able to be a part of and help to support, whether it be advancing preschool education for all 4-year-olds in New York, or helping to advance the world's fastest, largest public Wi-Fi network. Those were only possible because there was very strong clarity and there was citywide support for the direction that the city was moving. And so that one element is that we really need to push all of our cities for that type of transparency, that type of long-term vision about what we are going to prioritize, how we will define success in the days and years ahead. That, however, is just part one. Part two, which I unfortunately don't think that we have that many examples at globally, and is one of the reasons that I felt it critical to establish our new Global Center for Urban Transformation, is that these long-term strategic plans have to be shared visions where both the public and private sector is contributing. Because all too often what we see is that the burden of delivering on these very ambitious goals falls upon the public sector, meaning government themselves. And simply put, government cannot do this alone. One, we have to recognize that as we face economic uncertainty, that government revenues will fall, because government revenues are largely driven by tax revenues, right? And so the only way in which we're going to be able to, over time, deliver greater services, more consistent services, is by ensuring that we have the private sector at the table alongside government. And what does this mean in very practical terms? It means that once we set goals, whether those goals be about moving towards a net zero carbon future and reduction of greenhouse gases, or if they're goals about infrastructure and perhaps adding more recreational areas and green spaces, that we need to have accountability not only on what our governments will do, but on what private stakeholders will do as well. So that when we are setting those goals, that we recognize that, say, on something like advancing a reduction in greenhouse gases, that government has power to incentivize, it has power to put penalties in place, but the private sector also needs to lead. It needs to be transparent about its commitments for its buildings, for its facilities, and the reductions that they are going to put in place, and therefore the city will benefit from. And then last, but certainly not least, we have to acknowledge and recognize that the changes that we want to see require, in many cases, digital transformation. That we cannot achieve these significant changes in our cities without automating and modernizing the way in which we run cities, in which our businesses are run as well. And that technology adoption comes with great challenges. This was in many ways the driver for the World Economic Forum to work with the G20 to create the G20 Global Smart City Alliance. This is a global network of cities, governments, private sector institutions, academic institutions from around the world that are all working to help establish a minimum bar of governance policies to ensure that as you roll out new technologies in public spaces, that we are ultimately safeguarding the public, we're safeguarding our cities. That means protections against issues of cybersecurity, means protections when it comes to financial sustainability, interoperability of systems, to ensure that technology adoption does not actually unleash more problems than it brings solutions. And so these are just three ways in which we are working to help drive action, really collective action, to build cities. But I want to make sure that I underscore that this is not something that one institution can lead. We all have a vital role to play as we shape our future cities. If you're an entrepreneur, you have a role to play. If you're a government employee, you have a critical role to play. If you're a researcher, you also have a role to play, or a community organizer. That we are writing this next chapter. There are no, precise steps to be taken. And so what I hope happens over the course of this summit, and encourage you to be in touch with me and my team about, is helping to define the role that you can play, how you can contribute to ensuring cities that are more sustainable, more resilient, and perhaps most importantly, more equitable. So again, pleasure to be here, and look forward to watching the remainder of the summit.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for the great sharing on your vision and also your experience. While our audience, you're most welcome to raise questions. If you have questions, feel free to drop your questions in Q&A box, Q&A function. Meanwhile, while we are waiting for questions from the public, well, Jeff, I have one question. You have experience particularly in the government. You worked in the mayor office before, City Hall, and now in the World Economic Forum. How would you compare the differences of the role, and especially, I assume both role, when you were serving both role before and after, you also get in touch with the the private sector, the corporate. What would be the biggest challenge that you see that when public sector and corporate come together? What is the biggest challenge, and how do you feel usually the compromise should happen?
So I think, one of the things that I I learned and perhaps didn't fully appreciate until I joined the World Economic Forum is that the role of intermediaries. Really what the World Economic Forum is as the international organization for public-private collaboration is that we have the ability to act as a sort of neutral, non-commercial, independent convener to bring together the public and private sector in a safe space to sort of hash out their differences and work towards compromise and progress. And that role is really important. And it's not something that I think the World Economic Forum has to play, but it's a critical role that nonprofit organizations can play and should play, because, you know, I think back to you know, some of the different challenges that I faced in City Hall. I remember, for example, you know, in the early days as sort of the sharing economy was building up, and there was, you know, this immense tension between, say, the ride sharing apps like the Uber and Lyft type companies and in the United States, and then the taxi industry. And, you know, it was very difficult being in City Hall to actually bring everybody around the table and just sort of have an honest conversation. There was so much sort of political sensitivity. There was just a lot of distrust. And I really wish in those days that I had a sort of third party that I could go to as a kind of independent broker, if you will, that could invite my colleagues from the city government, that could invite folks from the private sector and really facilitate that. And I think that, you know, increasingly there will be more and more, you know, difficult conversations to be had, and that the role of sort of civil society or nonprofit organizations in facilitating those conversations and helping broker compromises and progress is going to be more and more important. That we should not expect you know, government or the private sector to always initiate that. Really, that is a role that that the third sector can play and should play. So that's just sort of one of my sort of learnings about the challenges of public-private collaboration.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I've got a few questions. And I think for now, at the hour here in Asia, in Hong Kong, on the live streaming here, most of our audience are mainland China based and also ASEAN based. I will summarize a little bit of that question. So you have mentioned about the term urban transformation. How these movement or you know, urban transformation as a whole, how do we position these? Well, okay. Should there be clear boundary between the public and private sector, or like you said, the third party, the intermediary is super important? Or do you foresee in the future that should be actually a new sector that really represent both public and private to conduct and undergo urban transformation? And yeah, maybe this question first.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I think the answer is yes, there have to be clear boundaries, but there needs to be very close coordination and there has to be shared accountability. The reason I think boundaries are critically important is that at the end of the day, you know, government and the private sector have different, there are ultimately different objectives for each, right? At the end of the day, the private sector has to generate revenue, it generates profits. And therefore, there has to be very strong clarity and a differentiation between, you know, what is the role of the private sector, what are the incentives, what are the benefits to the private sector, whereas, you know, the work of government is oftentimes correcting for faults or kind of the externalities of the market, right? That government oftentimes has to intervene where the natural profit incentives will not work to the benefit of all residents, right? And so I think it's very important to have boundaries, but it's also critically important to put more of a spotlight on what the private sector is doing to contribute to our cities and to hold the private sector accountable. You know, at our summit last week, one of the speakers, who was actually a community leader from Detroit, they said that, you know, so often as a city resident, you see new buildings pop up in front of you. You see so much development just come out of nowhere. And most of that development that they're talking about is private sector development, because the private sector oftentimes is not required by law to disclose as much of their planning processes. And so as a result, from the standpoint of communities, it comes as a surprise. And there's really no reason for that, and actually it causes more harm than anything, because it prevents the public sector and government in particular, and communities from planning accordingly. That if we can have greater transparency about the plans of the private sector, particularly as they pertain to our cities, that's going to enable government therefore to complement that better and to fill in the gaps.
Thank you, Jeff, for the great answer. We have a question from Nadisha from Sri Lanka, and I think I would generalize that for developing countries. You mentioned about the downturn of economic development due to COVID-19. And Jeff, you mentioned about long-term strategic planning and goals, so that the government and even the corporate interests can be aligned better. Meanwhile, I think the society, you know, talks a lot about lowest hanging fruit most of the time, so that things can be done easier, because it's probably clear to say, how do you juggle that? I mean, what would you choose between lowest hanging fruit always and also align the long-term strategic goals? What would be the principles of guiding?
Yeah, look, it is a balancing act. I can tell you, you know, as someone who worked in City Hall, your day-to-day is reactive, meaning that on a given day, you go in perhaps to the office with a plan of what you want to do, but the reality of your day is often dictated by whatever the crisis of the day is that you're responding to. You know, maybe that was a shooting that happened, or a fire. You know, maybe it's a you know, it's some health issues. You know, there's a variety of different crises that cities are addressing day to day. It is, though, essential that you have some staff in city government who are separated from that type of sort of the crisis of the day, because otherwise what happens is that you're always sort of you're on a treadmill. You're sort of running and running and running, but you're not actually moving anywhere. And so I do think that it is essential that for governments, but for the private sector as well, the only way in which you're going to make progress over time is to have some dedicated employees who are working on the longer term strategy, and being able to have a bit of that sort of big picture perspective. You will always have, you know, politicians who are going to go for, as you said, the low-hanging fruit. I think right now we're talking a lot about sort of COVID stimulus money for economic recovery, and there's trillions of dollars globally going into new infrastructure investment. And oftentimes when we're talking about infrastructure, we talk about two types of projects. We call them shovel ready. Those are your sort of low-hanging fruit, right? You know, you have potholes in your streets and you can pave over your potholes, or the shovel worthy projects. And those are the projects that, you know, it might take years to actually see the benefits, but they're actually what's needed, because perhaps the reason that you have those potholes in your street is because you have not actually invested in good sewage systems and ability to manage water. And so every time that you have heavy rains and that kind of thing, it causes, severe damage to your transportation system, right? And so again, we need to be thinking about that right balance between what we need for the short term, what we can do that can deliver quick results, but also what do we actually do for the long term to make sure we're actually creating real progress?
Thank you so much, Jeff. Given the time, I think I've got the last question here. I think the team of the Work North Forum has been working especially in small and medium-sized cities. And I think it's particularly important in the sense that contributing in a growing scale of economic values and also the supply chain. And with the COVID, it drives the population from the capital cities, metropolitan cities, back to the smaller cities. What would you place the importance of urban transformation in these smaller second-tier, third-tier cities? And how would you identify opportunities that our audience, no matter from policies or corporate or tech startups, they will be more motivated to capture?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that the mega cities of tomorrow may be the small and medium-sized cities of today. That the urbanization around the world is by no means happening in a certain sort of even predictable way, right? The fastest growing cities in the world are coming in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It's predicted that cities like Lagos and Dhaka will be among the largest cities in the world, and the size of those cities is even sort of hard for us to grasp. Regardless of the size of your city today, you need to be investing in digital infrastructure, ultimately to be able to manage the changes, the uncertainty that are coming in the years ahead. And that uncertainty may be, things that you have some control over, but meaning things like population growth and increased density, but it also may be things outside of your control, as we saw in the last couple of years with the COVID pandemic, that the only way in which cities are going to be able to manage these changes is by having real-time situational awareness, to actually understand what's happening on the ground, right? If you want to be able to address a health crisis, you need to actually know in real time, how many beds are available in a hospital. You need to understand, how to move people and goods from point A to point B efficiently. And so, digital transformation is essential for cities of all sizes. It is, without a doubt, more challenging for the small and medium-sized cities because they simply have less resources available, less in-house expertise. I'll tell you, really what I have learned, I hear echoed from my colleagues around the world, is that it really, the biggest challenge itself isn't the technology, it's the behavior change. It's the fact that, as you move towards maybe an analog system where government employees were doing all the work towards you, and you move towards maybe a cloud-based service, you're handing over some of that sort of responsibility to another third party, meaning that you add additional complexity, you add additional sort of stakeholders to a sort of system or process, and that's the really sort of disruptive, difficult change. And so, I don't actually think it matters what the area of digital transformation is, where you seek to change processes. But what I can tell you is that over time, as you do more of those transformations, as you begin to automate more of your processes, you as a city begin to adapt where you have a more sort of decentralized or distributed model of providing city services. And that ultimately, as you get more used to working, it is public-private collaboration, because ultimately your vendors, your technology providers are going to be private sector entities most of the time. You get better at sort of working with the private sector. You begin to set those boundaries. You begin to find that right balance of accountability, and you build trust, you build relationships, and it makes it easier as you take on the bigger projects down the road. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about a tech project that might be, in the thousands of dollars or in the millions of dollars. You're going to have a similar set of sort of discomfort and challenges initially, but it's going to position you better for the bigger projects down the road.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I really especially like your term trust. That goes up. Probably one last question. We have one from the audience again. So how would you ensure that I think the question here from Sion is, how do we ensure the annual budget align with the transformation strategy? I think he means about the long-term strategic planning, and how do we ensure that the budget and the implementation also align effectively? I would particularly like to hear maybe example of yours from New York. I mean, especially when you were in your own initiative with the local communities in New York, which is very complicated, for example, maybe in Hudson Yard or other places. And also when you also got into the position in the mayor office, what is your experience, aligning and collaborating with other departments like Department of Finance, and also coordinating in the agencies? What is your experience, and how do we ensure that alignment together in the long term?
Yeah, so the key word there is alignment, because regardless of if you're talking about one agency, two different departments or agencies within a city, or if you're talking about the city and an outside entity, oftentimes it's very difficult to exert control or direct influence. And so therefore, I think that, again, the reason that they chose to emphasize the long-term strategic plans is that if done well, they can provide a mechanism for alignment and also transparency of efforts. I think it's fair to say when it comes to budgets that, you're never going to have enough money to do what you want to do. You accept that as a given, and therefore you really need to think creatively about how to identify efforts that are complementary and how to sort of purposefully align those efforts. I'm actually going to give you first an example out of the summit last week that I thought was powerful. There's an effort in the city of Detroit called the Strategic Neighborhood Fund. And what the city has done is that they select particular neighborhoods, and for a dedicated period of time, they really look to mobilize the philanthropic community, the private sector, as well as government funding at a local and a federal level to concentrate investments in one geographic area. So really to think from a place-based strategy and look at how to align initiatives which together can create for vibrant communities. So that means investments in improving streetscapes, widening sidewalks and fixing roads, investment in supports for small businesses, work from the philanthropic community to help stabilize the housing market, enable renovations of local houses that that could lead to foreclosures and displacement of residents, arts programs to help really sort of create a vibrant culture in that community. And by overlapping these initiatives that on the surface might not seem necessarily as, one and the same, they feel different because they're focusing on the different elements that are all essential to create a vibrant, robust community, right? But the goal there is by purposely focusing on a particular geographic area and by mobilizing various stakeholders together, you're able to really have a holistic approach. And then there's a shift to look at another neighborhood. So in a moment in time, you force that alignment, you force that collaboration in an area, and you draw public attention on it, and therefore celebrate the work of different stakeholders in a community. On a sort of different element of that, you asked about my experience in New York, and I think one of the things that we learned in government, we strive to do, we still have a lot of work to do, is to encourage governments to think more like businesses. I think too often governments they almost view themselves more like a charity or a foundation or philanthropic entity where they have money and they spend the money without necessarily thinking about how their investments will generate more revenue or generate more wealth in the future. And I think that is very unfortunate, because the only way in which these projects become sustainable is if there's continued economic growth. If from a very mathematical standpoint, you need to have continued growth in tax revenues to cities. And so, one of the things that I thought was very ingenious that the city of New York did is they spent a whole lot of money after the September 11th attacks, investing in public safety and building out a real sort of state-of-the-art command and control center, worked closely with Microsoft to build out a whole set of different software platforms to connect together data sources. But what the city did, which was thinking like a business, is they worked out a deal with Microsoft where they enabled Microsoft to then license that software out to other cities, and the city therefore would generate licensing revenue every time cities benefited from that software, right? And so again, thinking of it not just as a one-time expense and you build a system and it's just for you, but actually how can you take that investment and how might others use that? And therefore, as you enable more entities to use that, you also have revenue that's generated for your city that can go into continued upgrades and improvements to yourself. So again, just, budgets shouldn't just be thought of as sort of one-time expenses that you spent, your one-time pots of money, you spend them down. You need to be thinking about how are you constantly refilling that pot and growing that budget.